Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second in our OSF Essentials series. This is on scoping and systematic reviews on the OSF. I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping things before we start off. And hopefully that should give everybody a minute to come in. So my name is Nadia Ortilt. I'm the Strategic Partnerships Manager at the Center for Open Science. Just a couple of reminders. Please use the Q&A box for questions. I have three of my amazing colleagues here on the call: Gretchen Giggin, who's our Information Services and Communities Manager, as well as Eric Olson and Daniel Steger from our product team. And they are here to answer all the questions that you have while I am rapid fire throwing information at you. So ask them in the Q&A so that they can help answer those questions. You're also going to receive an email with the recording and slides after the webinar, so don't worry if you missed something. But also introduce yourself in the chat portion, not the Q&A portion. Tell us who you are, why you're interested in the topic, where you're coming from institutionally or organizationally. And I also want to share just a couple of emails here in case there's anything that piques your interest that's specific to the work that we do after the webinar. So I'm the strategic partnerships manager. That means I engage with all sorts of organizations and institutions who are trying to think about bigger partnerships with our organization or with the OSF, who are also thinking about some of our products out that sit on top of the OSF, like OSF for Institutions. Gretchen Giggin is really our metadata guru. She also can answer any questions you have if you're from an organization or institution that's already partnering with us or paying for some of our services. And Crystal Stelton-Pohl, who's not here today, but she is our training and education manager, and you can email her with questions about training and evaluation. And big props to Crystal because she did an enormous amount of work to create a really wonderful training course that's self-paced that I'll talk about a little bit at the end of this webinar, because it's really relevant to a lot of the material that we talk about today. And in fact, some of the material that I'll be discussing, she dives into in great depth in this pre-registration and registered reports self-paced training that, again, we'll talk about at the end of this session. Again, put your questions in the Q&A at any time. Feel free to do that. We have over 250 people here, and it's climbing as I'm speaking, so there will likely be a lot of questions. So here's kind of what we're going to cover, and we'll start with some brief framing, like why register review, what the terminology means, how the OSF compares to platforms you may already be using. And then we're going to move into the OSF itself, so what a registration is, how to register one, and what templates to use for review work. We'll walk through the generalized systematic review template, so what it asks for, why. We're also going to cover how to handle things like registration metadata, what to do if your protocol changes and you need to make an update, and how to link your outputs once the review is complete. And we'll close with next steps and a little bit of time for questions. This session should run about 30 minutes. We'll save live questions for the end, but again, if you have questions while I'm speaking, just put them in the Q&A part of the Zoom interface. And as I'm talking, you might want to peek at some of these resources that I have linked here. So there's a template selection guide, there's a registrations help guide. There's also a course that I mentioned before, which the folks from my team will just drop in the chat, and we'll touch on some of those later as well, and we'll also send these links through to you, so feel free to peruse them, as well as your own OSF account, because I'll be referencing some parts of your dashboard later in the webinar. So big picture, and many of you might be very familiar with this already, some of you might not be, so forgive me for giving some general overview at the top. I want to kind of spend a couple minutes on this because it's relevant to the mechanics, and it is the why that explains some of the what of our generalized systematic review template. So evidence synthesis, like systematic reviews, scoping reviews, meta-analyses, are supposed to give us a kind of an accurate picture of what the research literature says on a given topic. but that picture can be distorted in ways that don't have anything to do with the quality of individual studies. Post hoc changes to search strategies or inclusion criteria, selective outcome reporting, and scope creep are all rigor problems, actually, in the review literature. So prospective registration or of a scoping or systematic review tries to address that by creating a public time-stamped record of your planned methods before you begin screening for these reviews. And if your final review then diverges from your protocol, readers can see it, you can explain it, and that transparency is good for those searching for evidence. So people who want to use your review to make decisions, and increasingly it can also be expected by journals. So for those of you coming from utilizing Prospero or who do this work every day, this isn't new information, but what's different is what the OSF can offer on top of the scoping or systematic review registration itself, which we'll get into in a little bit. So a quick terminology note, because these terms are used kind of inconsistently across different platforms and disciplines, and it can create some confusion. So I just want to say this up at the top. Registration is the act of submitting a study plan to any kind of public registry, and it establishes a record. And when it's done prospectively, like before the work begins, it's called a prospective registration. And that term, as many of you might be familiar, comes from clinical research, where prospective meant like before you enrolled the first patient. Pre-registration, which we use often at COS, a term we use often, is sometimes written with a hyphen. It means the same thing, but it emphasizes the specific timing. So outside of clinical research, pre means before you do the thing you say you're going to do. So, for example, before beginning data analysis, which includes looking at like summary statistics. A pre-analysis plan is a term actually from economics, and it refers specifically to the analysis plan that's created before accessing or collecting data. And strictly speaking, it doesn't have to be registered, but best practice is to register it. For review work specifically that we're focusing on today, prospective registration means before submitting your protocol, before you begin screening. That's the standard that like Prospero also uses, but we'll use registration throughout today's session as the like general term. If you have questions about any of this, you are not alone. Many people do. It's why we created an entire self-paced training module to help kind of tease apart some of this terminology, as well as the practical applications of it in a registration process. And just as some context, like one of the reasons that I'm even talking about this and why we're running this webinar is because we've seen an enormous uptick in the number of OSF registrations of scoping and systematic reviews on the OSF. And in particular, scoping reviews have really outpaced systematic reviews in the past 3 years. There's a lot of different reasons for that, including, Prospero not being the best place for scoping reviews, for example. We've also received a lot of feedback from librarians who are OSF users about the registration workflow on the OSF. So we're really happy that you're here. Please keep asking us questions, making suggestions as to how to make this better, because we're undergoing changes on the OSF all the time. We're trying to improve features and functionalities to better serve specific audiences. So it also helps us create resources that are actually useful for you in your work on the OSF. So I just want to situate the OSF relative to these other platforms that I mentioned that you're probably already using, because we're not suggesting you totally replace what's already working or only use the OSF or say the OSF is the best place. It's sort of situated within an ecosystem of other platforms. Prospero is domain specific. It's a moderated registry for systematic reviews. It's well recognized. It has a more of a narrow scope in terms of discipline and its functionality. Protocols.io is for sharing and publishing methods. It's great for step-by-step protocols. It has a versioning system, but it's not a registry in the same sense as of the OSF or Prospero. Figshare is primarily for data and output as a repository, and researchers use it to share all sorts of different types of supplementary materials, data sets, figures, presentations. It does assign DOIs like the OSF, and it supports open licensing. And the OSF is a little bit different because it's a general research infrastructure platform that supports a lot of aspects of the life cycle of research. You can currently build out a project, you can store files, you can collaborate with other people, you can register and convert a project to a registration, you can link outputs, it's all in one space. And we try, because we are a public registry, to encourage all material published on the platform or shared on the platform to be fair. We mint DOIs. We try to make material discoverable. A lot of review teams, based on our research and feedback that we've gotten, use Prospero and the OSF together. So they, will register with Prospero for certain requirements, and then they use the OSF for scoping reviews or like reviews outside of Prospero's discipline specific framework. So today we're going to focus on the OSF's registration capability specifically. And I want to be precise about what a registration is actually on the OSF, because there's like technical implications for that. And it's important that we're all on the same page, again, because of the way that terminology is used differentially on different platforms. So a registration on the OSF is a frozen, read-only, time-stamped snapshot of your study plan. Once submitted, the content of the registration can't be edited, although it can be updated. We'll talk about that in a little bit. It gets assigned a DOI. When it's public, it becomes a part of the public OSF registry. It can be searched, it can be cited. That's different from what you might be familiar with as an OSF project, which remains editable and can be made private or public like throughout the lifetime of that project. People and researchers and teams often think of it more as a working space, whereas the registration is like a formal citable record of your plan at a specific point in time. And there's two ways that you can start a registration. You can go directly to osf.io and start one from scratch, starting, entering your information into the registration form without an attached project, or you can start from an existing OSF project, in which case the registration pulls in the project's metadata and associated files. We recommend now starting from a project, but depending on how you've organized that project, depending on your team structure, depending on how well or poorly you've organized your files and supplementary material within a project, you might want to start from scratch. There's also, just to note, an admin approval process after you submit a registration. So contributors on a registration have time to approve, and it's automatically approved after a specific time window. And we'll talk about that in a few slides. So once you start a registration, you need to select a template. And so the OSF has a number of different templates outlined here. And the generalized systematic review template is designed specifically for what we're all here to talk about, which are systematic reviews and scoping reviews and other kinds of meta-analyses. The reason is because that template focuses on things that matter for these types of reviews. So search strategies, database selection, inclusion and exclusion criteria, query strings, and different types of validation approaches. And that's what you need to make sure your review is reproducible. General purpose templates on the OSF, like you see at the top there, so OSF pre-reg and the as predicted alternative to that, they're comprehensive. They're good for first-time users, or if you don't have a more specific option for those specific research types, as you can see listed below there. And just a practical note, you can download any of these templates as a Google Doc before you commit to it. We'll drop a link to the generalized systematic review template so you can look at that as I'm talking through it. I really encourage you to do that. The template guide has, or the template has, examples. It allows you to kind of think holistically about the registration before you commit to submitting it and having it be a permanent object on the OSF. So the different elements of the generalized systematic review template, there's different sections. You can see them here: metadata, landing page, review methods, search strategy, screening, extraction, synthesis, and quality assessment, as well as a review before you publish. At a high level, this template is organized around the different methodological decisions that determine whether your review can be reproduced or not. So what you searched, where you searched, what you included or excluded, and how you validated the process. There's also a required metadata section, and this is extremely important. If I can emphasize nothing else about how to engage with registrations on the OSF, it's that you should put in as much metadata as possible. So title, description, contributors, subjects, licensing, tags, funders. It's the same across all OSF registration templates. It's really important for discoverability. It's important to make your scoping or systematic review findable. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on that, but just really want to emphasize that that's extremely important. Um, as I said before, the generalized systematic review template includes a lot of examples, and it's designed to be used by researchers across disciplines. So some of the examples are probably going to be more relevant for you. Some will not be at all. Also, some of the fields may or may not be relevant for you. They're supposed to give you a sense of the level of specificity that's expected in the answers to those questions. But the goal of the template is not to force you to produce a polished document before you've started the review. It's to help you think through those methodological decisions in advance so that you can document them holistically, put them into the draft. And then when you do register the registration, the information in there is precise enough that somebody else can follow your process. And that's what in our research makes registrations that are published on the OSF more rigorous than others. Excuse me. So the first substantive section of the template is your search strategy. So that's where a lot of the specificity that I just mentioned matters. You want to document things like which databases you plan to search. The template asks you to be specific and explicit about all of them, including how you will handle things like gray literature. You also want to document things like your date range. So whether you're searching from a specific year or all available records or other types of search limiters, language restrictions, document type filters, for example. One thing the template also prompts you to consider is your query variation. So different databases have different frameworks for querying, including OSF's search database. So you want to document that in advance before you run it. And the benefit of that specificity is that if somebody wants to actually, update your review on your team, they know where to start from. But also, if there's unexpected results from the search, you have a record of exactly what you ran. The other section that's important to note for scoping and systematic reviews on this generalized systematic review template is the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So this is in the screening section of the template. And for systematic reviews, you'll typically be working, within some kind of structured framework for defining things like population or intervention or exposure. And for scoping reviews, you might want to you might be using population or concept or context, and the template doesn't prescribe those, but it expects you to be explicit in the criteria you apply when you're screening, and therefore what you put in these fields. And there's a place to document study design filters. So again, whether you're restricting your search to RCTs, or if you're including observational studies, or you're being very broad in your scoping review. So you want to make sure to be as explicit and specific there as possible. There's also a validation section that asks how you'll establish reliability in your screening process. And that, can vary, but if you document that in advance, it means that whatever validation approach you have isn't shaped by whatever happened in the first round of screening. And these sections are really important because this is kind of where the gap is made clear and transparent to those reviewing your registration and your evidence between what you had planned to do and then what you actually did and what actually came from that plan. And so the value of documenting all that very clearly in advance is that you can clearly explain the divergence in the future, but also you are able to do that because you have that material within the review. So I'll just walk through a couple of basic steps in creating this kind of scoping or systematic review registration on the OSF. If you want to follow along in a browser, now is a good time to log into your OSF account, or it just takes a couple of minutes to start a new OSF account, so you can do that too. But I'll have some screen shots here as well. so that you can follow along even if you don't want to do that. So when you're in your OSF dashboard, you can navigate to My OSF, you can select My Registrations, and you can see a button that allows you to add a registration. And if you click that, you're going to be asked whether or not you have content in an existing OSF project. If you've set up a project for your review and you want to attach it, you can select yes. If you're starting fresh without a project, like I said before, you can select no, either path works. And then you choose your template for review work. You want to choose the generalized systematic review template, and you can create a draft where you'll be brought into the registration form. So you also get a link to that draft so that you can return to the draft multiple times. You likely will not finish it in one go. You can always access that draft from your registrations page. Only when you're complete and you've reviewed it, you'll want to submit the registration. Just one note, and you can dive much deeper into this in our help guides as well as our self-paced training that I'll talk about at the end of the webinar. But if you want to submit your registration for blinded peer review, for example, you have to make sure that you don't include like identifying information in the metadata or attached files or like within the registration itself. And you'll use something called the embargo option. But we go into a lot more detail in that in other resources. We have limited time in this webinar. So you can add contributors to a registration, whether or not they have an OSF account. If someone doesn't have an account, you can add them as an unregistered contributor. You can just use their email address. They'll get an invitation. Contributors are assigned 3 permission levels, so and they are what they sound like. There's read and write, and administrator, and there's also a contributor, like a non-bibliographic contributor. So if you have somebody working on your team that doesn't want to appear or shouldn't appear in the citation for the registration, you can still add them as with some permissions to the registration. And this can be useful for people who are not authors. And a practical note also for review teams, if you are a librarian and you're leading the search for the or search design for the review, you should probably have administrator access so you can add to the sections of the registration and link things like outputs and things like that after. So in addition to thinking through the review itself, the study plan, the protocols, selection criteria, things like that, you also really want to think through your team's roles before you add everybody to the registration and submit it, because those are fixed as well, and they're important for future updates to the registration. And once you've submitted a registration, once you've gone through all those steps, there's 2 options for privacy on OSF registrations. So you can make a registration public immediately. It can get a DOI. It's discoverable. If you're not in the middle of a blinded review process and you just want to make it public, that's the fastest way to do it. Or you can place a registration under embargo. An embargoed registration is private. It's private until a date that you specify, up to 4 years from the date of submission, and then it becomes public automatically. As I mentioned before, if you're going through some kind of blinded review process, or if you just want to share your embargoed registration to select parties, there is something called view only links, which again, we go into much detail in our help guides, and some folks from the team can share that in the chat now if you need it. But that is useful if you need to share embargoed registration for peer review. And you can also anonymize it in that process. One important note, the anonymized view-only link can remove contributor names from a visible registration page. So if you do need to do that, that's something that you need to do when you're creating that view-only link. And another very important thing to note about privacy and registrations is that DOIs are only assigned to public registrations. So if it's under embargo, it won't resolve until the embargo ends. Returning back to making your registration of your review on the OSF as fair as possible, there's a couple of things that can really contribute to that. You can edit your metadata, as you can see there on your registration. You should have a clear descriptive title, a thorough description of your review topic and scope. You can use tags and subject fields as generously as you'd like, and those feed into OSF search. Tags should move kind of from general to specific. So if you're using a broad term like systematic review or evidence synthesis, you want to add topic specific keywords. Those subjects are selected from a controlled vocabulary, and they really help with cross-platform discoverability and also OSF search. If you have any questions about metadata, I really highly recommend that you review the amazing webinar that my colleague Gretchen Gigan ran about a month ago on OSF search, which really is also about OSF metadata. And she can drop the link to that in the chat. Extremely helpful for most powerfully using OSF search, and also helps you think through a little bit how you might want to use metadata to make your registration as fair as possible. So I do highly recommend watching that. Leave this webinar and go to that webinar and watch it first and then come back. Other things that you should make sure to include and think through are licensing. So OSF supports standard open licenses like Creative Commons. If you don't have a reason to restrict reuse, a license like CC BY or CCO are the most permissive, and they're really useful to other researchers. The subjects and funding metadata fields are really designed to help connect your registration with external systems. So if your research is funded by an organization in the Crossref funder registry, you can add that funder information, and it enables them to find the work that they funded, can help support compliance with mandates that they might have. And in general, the more complete your registration is in terms of template fields, metadata, and connected files, which I'll talk about in a second, the more useful it is to someone who wants to update your review, replicate it, or learn from it. So I think the registration itself is a method as well as a resource itself. One thing that's specific to the OSF that's really a powerful resource that not a lot of people, not as many people as should utilize, but I'll emphasize it here, is that once your review is complete, if you have outputs available, you can link them to your registration. And this is where the OSF is a little bit different as an integrated lifecycle open science platform. We support a set of these open practice badges that recognize and signal specific forms of transparency. So if you earn a badge, if they're colored as opposed to just black and white, it means you've linked a resource that meets that badge criteria, and it makes it publicly available or it can be publicly available with a DOI. So for review work like scoping and systematic reviews, you might want to think about the data badge. So for publicly sharing, for example, your screening log or extracted data set, or analytic code if you use scripts for analyses, materials for things like screening forms, and papers for the final published article once it's available. So to add a resource, you want to navigate to the resources tab on your registration page, or click those resources like data, for example. You can enter a DOI, you can select the resource type, you can add a brief description. It's colored once the resource is linked. There are a lot of journals that recognize and display these badges on published articles. If you're submitting to one of them, linking your resources to your OSF registration is how you might demonstrate compliance with that badge requirement. You can also link externally. So if you have like a data set, for example, on Figshare, your protocol is elsewhere, you can add the DOI and connect it to your registration. So the OSF doesn't require that you host everything on the OSF. It's just much better if you link it and use the OSF as that connective tissue. So that was a lot of material in 30 minutes. I want to say one thing, which is that we have this amazing deep dive into pre-registration and registered reports, which is really directly relevant to scoping and systematic reviews on the OSF. We just launched it like 2 weeks ago. and highly recommend diving into it. And if you have any questions about that, you can email Crystal. To make sure that we have time here, I want to leave time for any questions. And as I said before, I want to make sure that you have that template for the generalized systematic review to look it through. The registration help guide on help.osf.io covers a lot of the full workflows that I described, including a lot of detailed instructions. If you really want to go deeper on scoping or systematic reviews and you want to talk to me directly, feel free to email me. It's nadja@cos.io, and I can connect you to the right people or set up a call. We love your feedback. And you can feel free to reach out to anyone on our team. So now I'm going to pause briefly while I look at the Q&A because I have not had a chance to do that. Let's see here. So a lot of questions answered. Eric, do you want to answer the question live or this scoping review in Prospero? I see that.
Yeah, I think actually I put that because I think you answered it. But did want to just ask Asifa if that was clear to you when Nadia reviewed that earlier, and if not, then we can review that again.
Yeah, so Prospero scoping reviews are not technically supposed to go on Prospero, especially for non-clinical uh, disciplines or disciplines that fall outside of their specific disciplinary categories. So that's the reason why. And some of that has to do with the technical elements of like how the protocol and selection criteria are like added and what the iterations on a scoping review look like versus a systematic review. So okay, Carol Cannon says, do you have an example of a protocol that's been filled out impeccably that one could use to make sure one's protocol will be considered outstanding? I'm not sure if I did a good job. We can send through in our follow-up links to some examples of really great scoping and systematic reviews that have used metadata, that have answered to the best of their ability, lots of templates, and we'll try to find a recent ones to send through to you. So you'll get that in your follow-up. Could you please share the document? I'm not sure what you mean by that about the document protocols with us. If you mean the template, then we will definitely be sharing that in our follow-up. Let's see. Yeah, so the difference between scoping and systematic reviews and where this falls in the timeline of conducting research. So I'll just go back. So there are actually two different ways of conducting a review. So scoping reviews are assessing like the scope of literature on a specific topic, and they can help determine whether a systematic review is warranted. But a systematic review is actually asking a specific research question and then trying to answer it by summarizing evidence from literature using specific selection criteria. So they're actually two different types of reviews. The timeline is a little bit more complicated because depending on what discipline you're coming from, that might be happening at different times. But there's a lot more information about this that and a lot more complexity to this than I can answer in like 2 minutes. So, Michael, if you have more questions about that, please reach out to us or specifically to Crystal, who has been in the weeds in this for a long time now, so can answer that. If folks are dropping stuff in the chat, let me know because I'm just looking at the Q&A questions. Just ensure. Yeah, so anonymous. Yeah, there's two ways of creating a registration. So you can do what you said, which is to create a project first and then use that project to create a registration. Or you can just create a brand new registration. And yes, if you're just submitting a review to the OSF registry, which is our like generalized repository registry. It's we don't have an editorial moderation framework on our end, so anything you submit is just going to be on the platform. If you submit to a community operated registry that may or may not have its own registration template, that moderation and acceptance of the registration is a different can of worms because they do have editorial policies for the material that's accepted into the registry. Um, yeah, so for Asefa, who asked, what is the advantage of registering systematic reviews on the OSF rather in Prospero? There's a lot more flexibility on the OSF in registering a systematic review. And a huge benefit is that you're able to link to a lot of other material that might make your systematic review more rigorous or robust. So if you have, again, data or analytic code or a paper that is eventually published that's linked to that registration, you can link all of that together within your registration and have that badge indicate whether or not you have all of that supplementary material. Could I register the title of a systematic review paper without data? I'm not sure what you mean by that. You can, there is some flexibility within the template um, not include a lot of material in answers to template questions, although we encourage the best use of our templates, not the worst case use, which would be to not include some information before publishing. There are a number of updates that you can make to registration, but they're very limited and they're supposed to be done under very specific circumstances. Again, a lot of this we dive into a little bit more in our help guides. Um, the question about editorial committee, that's only for community operated registries if you submit a registration to those, but not if you submit to the OSF registries. Okay. And then in terms of, we'll send through some best case examples of different scoping and systematic reviews so that you have examples of those. And I'll emphasize that we have a lot of guidance and information around registrations generally and around pre-registrations, both in the self-paced training course that I mentioned, which is hosted on LMS, so you can go through it at your own pace. That's the one we gave you a discount code for. But we also have free open help guides with a lot of material in those help guides to help you make some of these assessments, and some of them are discipline specific, so I can't necessarily answer them here. So we are basically at time, and I think some of these questions I'm not able to answer. Some of them, Eric, can you answer this one just in our last minute? So this anonymous attendee who asked, if I can't get a response from one of my contributors on a registration, then my protocol won't be registered until they accept it within that 48-hour period. Can you confirm that that is correct?
So when you submit your registration, assuming there's no embargo, your contributors that have the highest level of permission that the OSF offers, they will get that option to accept or reject what you've submitted. If they all accept, it'll be public right away. If any of them reject it, it'll go back to draft, and you'll be informed of that. If there is no action from one or all of the contributors, then it will be public in 48 hours from from the point you submitted it.
Okay, we are at time. There are other questions here. That is awesome. Feel free to email them to me, nadja at cos.io, or to any of the other members of our team. You'll be getting a follow-up email with a lot of information. So please have a look through that. Please watch, the OSF Essentials webinar series that we just ran last month, and also sign up for some of our other OSF Essentials webinars. We have one on fair metadata. We have licensing basics on the OSF coming up, and a bunch of others. So we hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone.